It was a day like any other for Officer Richard Donovan, a man whose career had been built on taking the law into his own hands. He had seen his share of criminals, drug dealers, gang members, petty thieves, but today was different. Today, he was about to make one of the most humiliating mistakes of his life. He had been called to testify in a minor case of mistaken identity, and in his rush, he had taken the wrong man into custody. What Donovan didn't know was that the man he had handcuffed and brought in for questioning was no petty criminal. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't even someone from his neighborhood. His name was James Brooks. James was dressed casually that morning, nothing out of the ordinary, just a simple shirt and jeans, but he carried himself differently. There was an air about him, something that made him stand tall even when facing an authority figure like Donovan. A look that said, "I'm not the man you think I am." And little did Donovan know, this was not just any random person. James wasn't a local. He wasn't someone that could be easily dismissed with a quick label or assumption. He was, in fact, a seasoned federal prosecutor, with more power in his pinky than most cops could ever dream of wielding. Donovan, of course, didn't know this. In his mind, the man sitting across from him was another black male, likely to be guilty of something, anything. It was a dangerous stereotype, one that Donovan had bought into over the years, and one that would come back to haunt him. In his mind, James didn't stand a chance. He was just another face in a crowd of potential criminals, just another man to push through the system. But as the day wore on, as the minutes stretched into hours, Donovan began to feel a strange unease. James wasn't acting like most of the people he'd encountered in his line of work. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't pleading or begging for mercy. Instead, he was calm, collected, even friendly in a way that made Donovan uncomfortable. James didn't seem to care about the situation he was in, almost as though he were an outsider looking in. As Donovan went through the motions, reading off charges, making accusations, something strange happened. James didn't respond with anger or fear. Instead, he sat back and waited for his moment. He let Donovan rattle on, then smiled politely, almost as if amused by the whole thing. And when he finally spoke, when he dropped the bombshell that would leave Donovan reeling, the entire room went silent. "I think you might want to double-check your paperwork, officer," James said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that cut through the tension in the room. "Because I'm not just any man. I'm not just some black guy you can toss into the system. I'm a federal prosecutor, and this little mix-up? It's going to cost you." Donovan froze. His hand, which had been holding a clipboard filled with paperwork, went still. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of James's words sank in. It was a statement that should have been met with disbelief, but Donovan wasn't a fool. He could see the confidence in James's eyes. The calm, composed demeanor that screamed authority. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And then, just as Donovan opened his mouth to speak, James cut him off. "I wouldn't make any hasty decisions if I were you," he said, his voice now a little colder. "You might want to consult with your superior before you do anything else. Trust me, it won't end well for you if you don't." The room was filled with a sudden, suffocating silence. Donovan's mind raced. He was a cop. He had been on the force for nearly 2 decades, seen countless cases, faced criminals who had put his life at risk. But never, in all his years of service, had he ever found himself in this position. He had just brought the wrong person to the wrong place, and now his entire career was on the line. As Donovan looked at James, trying to process the gravity of the situation, he could feel the walls closing in around him. How had he made such a massive mistake? How could he have possibly misjudged someone so completely? James Brooks was no criminal. He wasn't someone who could be tossed aside or intimidated by a badge and a gun. He wasn't someone who could be easily swept under the rug. He was a man who had worked tirelessly to build a reputation of integrity and justice, someone who had the power to make or break cases, someone who had the ear of people far more powerful than Donovan could ever hope to reach. And yet, here they were. The tension between the two men was palpable. Donovan stood there, unsure of what to say, his mind spinning as he tried to regain control of the situation. But it was clear that James wasn't going to make this easy for him. This was no longer just about a mistake, it was about power. It was about the systems they both represented, and how easily those systems could be manipulated by someone who knew how to play the game. Donovan glanced at the door, knowing that the longer he waited, the deeper he was sinking. He needed to make a choice, and fast. But what choice could he make when the man sitting across from him was a federal prosecutor, someone who had the ability to tear apart his career in an instant? But before he could make any decisions, there was a knock at the door. It was a small, insignificant sound, barely a tap, but it sent a chill down Donovan's spine. The moment had arrived, the moment that would determine everything. Would he be able to cover up his mistake, or was this the end of his career? As the door slowly creaked open, Donovan found himself caught in a web of uncertainty. He wasn't prepared for what came next. And neither was anyone else. Would James Brooks use his power to destroy Donovan's life, or would he let him off the hook? Would the truth come out, or would it all remain buried under layers of corruption and fear? The next few minutes would change everything, and Donovan could feel the tension rising, the stakes getting higher. And then, just before the door fully opened, James's voice cut through the room once again. "You've made your choice, officer. Now it's time to see what you're really made of." The door creaked open slowly, almost intentionally. Officer Donovan stiffened, his hand tightening around the clipboard, but he didn't dare turn around. He knew who it was. He could feel the weight of it in the air, the unmistakable tension of someone in power walking into a room where their presence would change everything. The figure that appeared in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of authority that Donovan had no choice but to respect. It was Sergeant Mallerie, Donovan's direct superior. Her reputation preceded her, sharp, no-nonsense, and ruthless when it came to making sure things were done by the book, even if that book was occasionally bent to fit her needs. The look in her eyes told Donovan everything he needed to know. She knew something was off, and she wasn't happy about it. "Everything okay in here, Donovan?" Mallory's voice was low but carried an edge that made Donovan's throat tighten. She hadn't even looked at James yet. Her gaze was fixed on Donovan, and it felt like she was dissecting him with her eyes. I think we've got a problem," Donovan stammered, still unable to fully process the situation. It was a mistake, that's all it was. Just a mistake, but one that he had no idea how to fix. Mallory's eyes flicked briefly to James, then back to Donovan, clearly weighing what she was seeing. "A problem?" she echoed, her lips curling into a thin line. "What kind of problem?" Donovan hesitated. He could feel the sweat beginning to form on his brow. Mallerie was a woman who thrived on control, and he'd never been so aware of how little control he had in this moment. His usual confidence was gone. It felt like he was suddenly under the microscope, his every action scrutinized, dissected, analyzed. And he hated it. "Sir," Donovan started, his voice cracking under the pressure. "This man, he's not who we thought he was." Mallerie raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "He's not a suspect, Sergeant. He's a federal prosecutor." Donovan finally let the words tumble out in a rush, as though if he said them fast enough, they wouldn't have time to sink in and make everything worse. There was a moment of silence. James didn't flinch, but Mallory's eyes narrowed. She didn't speak at first, her gaze shifting between Donovan and James as if she were processing the magnitude of what she had just heard. Then, without warning, Mallerie stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a quiet, deliberate click. "You're telling me," she began slowly, her voice ice-cold, "that you, a seasoned officer, just brought a federal prosecutor into this station on what, a hunch?" She didn't wait for him to respond, her tone sharp as a razor. "What the hell were you thinking?" I didn't know," Donovan stammered, trying to defend himself. "I thought, he just looked like another guy off the street. Another black man who—" "That's the problem, Donovan," Mallerie cut in, her words like a slap. "You assumed. You didn't check the details. You didn't verify who he was before you dragged him in here. And now you're telling me you brought in the wrong person. A damn prosecutor. You're lucky this didn't blow up in our faces already." James, who had been quietly observing the exchange, shifted slightly in his seat. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that Donovan couldn't quite place. Was it amusement, or was it something darker? Mallerie turned her attention to him, her gaze sharp now. "You," she said, her voice suddenly softer, though no less commanding. "What's your name?" "James Brooks," he replied calmly, his voice smooth like silk. He didn't flinch under her scrutiny, didn't look away. He was entirely unbothered by the tension in the room, like a man who knew exactly how this would play out. James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms in a relaxed manner. "I think there's been some misunderstanding here," he said. But I'm not here to make trouble. I'm just here because someone decided to make a very, very bad mistake. His tone was almost conversational, like he was discussing the weather, not the fact that he had been wrongly detained. Donovan felt his stomach churn. The more James spoke, the more he realized how deep he had fallen into this mess. It wasn't just a matter of mistaken identity anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and Donovan was in over his head. Mallerie was still studying James, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, but her posture had shifted slightly. She was no longer standing tall and domineering. Now, she was leaning in, a subtle sign that the situation had escalated far beyond her initial irritation. Federal prosecutor, huh? Mallerie mused, as though testing the words on her tongue. You wouldn't be here if that were true. You'd be in a courtroom, making deals, taking down bad guys, not sitting here with two cops who, I assure you, Sergeant, James interrupted smoothly, I'm very much who I say I am. And if you don't believe me, you can call the district office. I'm sure they'll clear it up quickly. He didn't even flinch, not one bit. The confidence in his voice was palpable. Mallerie was silent for a long moment, her mind clearly working overtime. Donovan could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She knew that if James was indeed who he claimed to be, this could quickly spiral into something much worse. She could feel it, just like Donovan did, that this wasn't just about a case of mistaken identity. There was something far more complicated lurking beneath the surface. Something that neither of them could see just yet, but both could sense. Well, then, I suppose we should make a call, Mallerie said finally, her voice carrying an undertone of barely contained frustration. She turned to Donovan. You, she snapped, stay here and don't touch anything. I'll handle this. Donovan opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Mallerie was already out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As soon as she was gone, the tension in the room seemed to ease, though only slightly. James relaxed further in his chair, his eyes never leaving Donovan. You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you? He said, his voice low but laced with a certain kind of menace. It wasn't an outright threat, but it carried the weight of one. Donovan swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. He was in over his head. What had seemed like a simple mistake was quickly becoming something he couldn't control. I didn't know, Donovan muttered, his eyes darting to the door. I never would have. James raised a hand, cutting him off. Doesn't matter now. But know this, officer. This isn't the end of it. You've opened a door you don't want to walk through. And once it's opened, there's no going back. Donovan's mind raced. What had James meant by that? What was he getting at? The mystery deepened, and Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger than just a mistaken identity was unfolding in front of him. Something that was going to change everything. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and Mallerie stepped back in. She didn't look at Donovan as she crossed the room, instead focusing all her attention on James. There was something different in her demeanor now, a change in her body language, the way she stood, the way she held herself. She wasn't just dealing with a man who had been wrongly arrested anymore. Now, it seemed, she was dealing with a problem that was far above her pay grade. Mallory's eyes flicked to Donovan for just a second before she fully focused on James again. There was a new edge to her demeanor now, something colder, more calculating. Donovan noticed it instantly. She wasn't acting like the officer who had walked into this room a few minutes ago. There was no longer any sign of the woman who had been angry at his mistake. Now she seemed almost wary. Well, it checks out, Mallerie said after a long pause, her voice almost flat. She nodded to herself, as if reaffirming what she already knew but didn't want to admit. James Brooks, federal prosecutor. That's a hell of a thing. I never would have guessed. She looked at Donovan briefly, her gaze sharp. How did you miss that? Donovan's face reddened. I swear, I didn't. He cut himself off, knowing it wouldn't do any good to explain further. The mistake had already been made. He wasn't going to talk his way out of it. Mallory's attention shifted back to James, who remained silent, watching them both closely. There was something unsettling in the way he observed them, as if he were a spectator at a play, waiting for the actors to finish their lines so the next act could begin. I don't want this to blow up, Mr. Brooks, Mallerie continued, her tone now cautious but still commanding. I'll be honest, I'm not thrilled to be dealing with something like this. You're not a suspect, but I have to make sure you understand that this whole thing could still cause a lot of problems, especially with your position. You're a federal prosecutor. You know how these things can get messy. James gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Oh, I understand. Trust me, Messy is my middle name. His voice was smooth, but there was something in it that sent a chill down Donovan's spine. Something about the way James said those words, like he was already calculating every angle of the situation. Mallerie didn't seem to pick up on the subtle undertone. She nodded, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. She turned to Donovan. Get out of here. I need to think. Wait outside while I talk to Mr. Brooks. Donovan didn't hesitate. He knew better than to argue with Mallerie when her mind was set on something. He stood up quickly, avoiding eye contact with both Mallerie and James, and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, but the silence in the hallway didn't offer the relief he had hoped for. His thoughts swirled in a frantic mix of confusion, regret, and unease. What the hell had just happened? He'd brought in the wrong man, a man who had the power to ruin his entire career with a single phone call. Donovan tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe James would just let it go. Maybe Mallerie would talk him down, but deep down, he knew better. This wasn't something that would just disappear. Not this time. In the dimly lit hallway, Donovan leaned against the wall, trying to calm his racing heart. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to take slow, deep breaths. He had to think. He had to figure out what to do next. What would his life look like after this? Would he still have a badge? A job? Would anyone in his department even trust him after this kind of mistake? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from behind him. He turned to see Officer Harris, a rookie who had only been on the force for about 6 months, walking toward him. Harris was a good kid, eager to prove himself, but Donovan wasn't in the mood for small talk. Hey, Donovan, Harris said cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Everything okay in there? I heard some shouting earlier. Donovan shook his head, glancing at the door to the interrogation room. It's fine. Just a mix-up. Harris raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to it. A mix-up? You sure? You don't look fine. Donovan sighed, feeling a surge of frustration. I don't want to talk about it right now, Harris. Just stay out of this. But Harris wasn't easily deterred. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. I've been here long enough to know when something's not right. And it's obvious that something's off. He paused, then added, is it about the prosecutor in there? Donovan froze. He hadn't told anyone who James really was. How had Harris figured it out? Harris seemed to notice the shift in Donovan's expression, and his voice lowered even further. I overheard a bit. Just a few words. Federal prosecutor, huh? You sure we're handling this the right way? Donovan's stomach twisted, and he glanced at the door again. He had no answers for Harris, no reassurance. He was in too deep, and everyone around him was starting to sense it. I don't know, Harris. I really don't. Harris nodded, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. Look, Donovan, I don't know what's going on in there, but if this is bigger than you think, maybe you should be careful. People with power, federal prosecutors, guys like that, they don't get treated like regular people. You might want to make sure you don't get caught in the crossfire. Before Donovan could respond, Harris turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His words lingered in the air, and for the first time in his career, Donovan truly felt the weight of the badge he wore. He had always prided himself on knowing how to navigate the system, how to handle tough situations. But this was something else entirely. A mistake like this could cost him everything. And as much as he wanted to believe that Mallerie could smooth things over, that James would just walk away, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something far more dangerous was coming. Back in the interrogation room, James was still sitting calmly, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Mallerie stood at the window, talking quietly into her phone. Donovan could only catch snippets of her conversation, but the tone of her voice was enough to tell him she was speaking with someone high up. Probably someone who could make his life even more miserable if they found out about his mistake. James seemed to be in no hurry. He sat there, casually sipping the coffee that had been brought in for him earlier, as if time was on his side. But Donovan knew better. James wasn't just some government official looking to resolve a misunderstanding. There was something more going on here. Something he wasn't telling them. Donovan's eyes drifted back to the door. He could hear Mallerie's voice now, rising slightly in volume. She wasn't happy, that much was clear. Whoever she was talking to wasn't making things any easier. Donovan couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The tension in the air was enough to tell him everything. Then, as if on cue, Mallerie ended her call. She turned toward Donovan, her face unreadable. "Get back in there," she said, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Donovan didn't argue. He walked back into the room, trying to ignore the knot that had formed in his stomach. This wasn't over. Far from it. And as he sat down, his eyes flicked to James, who was watching him with that same unsettling calm. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Mallerie stepped in, closing the door behind her with an almost deliberate slowness. She didn't look at Donovan as she took her seat. Her gaze was fixed solely on James, like she was waiting for him to say something, anything, that would give her a clue about where this was heading. Donovan could only wonder. What was James planning? What game was he playing? The door slammed shut behind Mallerie, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Donovan's heart beat faster, the pulse loud in his ears, as he looked between James and Mallerie. There was something about the way Mallerie held herself now, like a person walking a tightrope, balancing precariously. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was a distinct sense of danger in the room. James Brooks wasn't just a prosecutor. He was a ticking bomb, and Donovan could feel the pressure rising. Mallerie folded her arms across her chest, her eyes locking onto James with a hard intensity. "I don't care who you are, or who you know, Brooks," she said, her voice low but firm. "But you're not going to walk out of here without some kind of explanation. What the hell is going on? Why are you here?" James didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, sipping his coffee with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. It was maddening how composed he was, how unaffected by the situation. Donovan was about to speak up, to try and clear the air, but Mallerie raised a hand, stopping him cold. "No, Donovan," she said sharply. "This is between me and him." Donovan closed his mouth. He wanted to protest, wanted to argue that he was just as much a part of this mess as anyone, but something in Mallory's tone made him stay silent. She was in charge now. She was the one holding the reins, and something in her body language made him realize just how deep the hole had gotten. James finally spoke, his voice smooth as ever. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't just about me. This is bigger than some arrest gone wrong. It's about what's happening in this city. In this department. And you're in the middle of it whether you like it or not." Mallerie didn't flinch. "I'm in the middle of what?" James leaned forward, his expression shifting from relaxed to something much more serious. "I don't have all day, Sergeant. Let me make this simple for you. The system you think you're working for? It's broken, and I'm here to fix it. But not just anyone is going to make it out of this. You," he gestured to Donovan, "and your department? You're part of a much larger problem. And if you're smart, you'll get out while you can." Mallory's jaw clenched. "You think you're going to intimidate me? Or Donovan? You're out of your depth, Brooks. This is a mistake." "Oh, this is no mistake," James replied, his tone hardening. "You're just too deep in it to see it. I'm not here to make threats. I'm here because I've got evidence. Evidence that goes all the way to the top. And it's only a matter of time before people start looking your way." The words hung in the air, and Donovan felt his pulse quicken. He couldn't tell whether James was bluffing or not, but the way he spoke, the cold certainty in his voice, made Donovan feel as though he were standing on the edge of something huge. Something dangerous. "Evidence?" Mallory's voice was sharp. "What evidence? You came in here and you—" "That's not what matters right now," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What matters is this. You two, whether you want to admit it or not, are already part of something that you can't just walk away from. You're tangled up in it. And if you try to deny it, I'll make sure you understand just how deep this goes." The words hit Mallerie like a punch to the stomach. Her eyes flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty crossing her face. It was so brief that Donovan almost missed it, but it was there. She wasn't sure anymore. Maybe she'd thought this was just a minor mistake, something that could be cleaned up with a few phone calls. But now, she was starting to realize that this could cost her far more than her career. "I don't know what you think you're playing at, Brooks," Mallerie said, her voice taut. "But you've made a big mistake. You're not in control here. We are." James didn't react right away. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. And then, finally, he leaned forward again, his voice lowering to a whisper, but Donovan could hear every word clear as day. "Control?" James's lips curled into a cold smile. "You think you're in control, Sergeant? Let me make it clear. You're standing in the middle of a storm, And the worst part is, you have no idea who's really pulling the strings." He let the words linger in the air, letting the weight of them settle over Mallerie. Donovan was frozen, caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. There was something unnerving about James's presence in this room. Something chilling. Every word he spoke seemed to chip away at the fragile sense of security they had. Donovan could feel it now, the truth behind James's words. He wasn't just a prosecutor. He wasn't just a victim of a wrong arrest. He was a man with power, with connections, with knowledge. And that made him dangerous. Mallory's expression was unreadable now, but Donovan could see the shift in her body language. Her shoulders were tense, her fists clenched at her sides. She was used to being in control, used to being the one who held all the cards. But James was turning the tables on her, slowly but surely. "I don't have time for games," Mallerie said, trying to regain some of her composure. "If you're trying to threaten us, it won't work." James didn't even flinch. "This isn't a threat. This is a warning." He sat back, his hands folding neatly in front of him. "I suggest you listen, because if you don't, things are going to get much, much worse." Donovan's mind was racing. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a storm about to break. What did James mean by this? What was he really saying? Was he talking about corruption in the department? Was this part of some larger scheme? And why had he decided to drop this bombshell on Mallerie and him? Before Donovan could think through the dozens of questions swirling in his mind, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. The sound was jarring in the silence of the room. Mallory's head snapped toward the door, her eyes flashing with irritation, but James just smiled, as if he'd been expecting this. "Come in," Mallerie called, her voice tight. The door opened, and Officer Harris stepped in, looking nervous but determined. "Sergeant Mallerie," he began, glancing at James before focusing on Mallerie, "there's someone here to see you. Someone important. They said it's about the Brooks case." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Donovan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The timing was too perfect, too precise. Who could be walking in now, and what did they know about James? Harris looked back at Mallerie, his expression serious. "They're asking for you directly. They said it's urgent." Mallory's eyes flicked back to James, and for a moment, Donovan thought he saw a flash of recognition pass between them. Something unspoken, something heavy. Then Mallerie turned to Harris. "Send them in," she said, her voice low but filled with a strange mixture of caution and command. The door creaked open again, and a tall, clean-shaven man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with quick, professional precision. He didn't wait for an invitation. His gaze shifted from Mallerie to James, and then, finally, to Donovan. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. James was smiling now. He didn't need to say anything. Because this wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was about to explode into something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. And the man in the suit? He was just the beginning. The man in the tailored suit stepped into the room with an air of undeniable authority, his every move calculated and deliberate. Donovan barely had time to process the shift in the atmosphere before the stranger's eyes locked onto James, and something unspoken passed between them. Mallerie, standing at the edge of the room, had already taken a step back, her arms uncrossed, and her body tense. She seemed to recognize something about the man, something that immediately shifted the balance of power once more. The man didn't acknowledge anyone directly at first. Instead, he looked at James with a peculiar mix of disdain and recognition, as if he were sizing him up, not as a prosecutor or a detainee, but as a piece in a much larger, far more dangerous game. Donovan could feel the hairs on his neck stand up as the man's sharp gaze flickered over to him. For a moment, he thought the world might stop spinning, that time might stand still, but it didn't. "I see the situation's become more complicated than expected," the man said, his voice low but dripping with cold precision. Donovan's stomach sank. The man wasn't just here about the case anymore. He wasn't just another official coming to clean up the mess. The tension in the room had shifted, deepened. There was something else at play. Something far darker. Mallerie stiffened beside him, her eyes flickering momentarily to Donovan before locking onto the stranger. "I didn't expect anyone from that side to show up here today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I think it's more about what you want, Sergeant. And what you're willing to do to keep things under control." Donovan's heart hammered in his chest. There it was again, the mention of control. Every word the man said seemed to add another layer of weight to the already oppressive atmosphere. But this time, it wasn't just about James being a federal prosecutor or a mistake being made. It was something much larger. Something that, in all his years on the force, Donovan had never even considered. Let's cut to the chase, the man continued, his eyes never leaving Mallory's face. This whole situation? It's a risk. A very big one. The kind of risk that people don't usually walk away from. I'm here to ensure that your oversight doesn't go any further. And I'm here to make sure that certain information stays buried. Permanently. Mallory's face hardened. What the hell are you talking about? James, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. What he's saying, Sergeant, is that you're no longer in control. You never were. His words were slow, deliberate, but there was a sharpness in them that made Donovan's stomach twist. Mallory's fists clenched. You can't be serious, she shot back, her voice rising now. You think you can come in here and make threats, that you can? The man in the suit interrupted, his calm demeanor never faltering. No one's making threats, Sergeant. We're just talking about the reality of the situation. You've got a decision to make. Either you cooperate, or things get very ugly. And when I say ugly, I mean you and your department won't be the only ones paying the price. Your career, your livelihood, your freedom, those are just the tip of the iceberg. Donovan could feel his hands start to sweat. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This wasn't even about James being a federal prosecutor. No, it was much worse than that. This was about something far deeper, something so entrenched in the system that Mallerie was caught in the middle of it without even realizing. And Donovan, by extension, was now tangled in it too. What's it going to be, Sergeant? The man in the suit asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you want to get out of this clean, or do you want to see how deep this rabbit hole really goes? Mallerie stood motionless, her face pale. For the first time since she had entered the room, she seemed lost. Not in control. Not the hard-nosed officer who always knew how to handle every situation. The weight of the man's words pressed down on her, and Donovan could see her mind racing. Calculating, trying to figure out what to do. What was her next move? James, still seated at the table, was watching the entire scene unfold with an eerie calmness. Donovan glanced at him again. There was something unsettling about the way James seemed to be letting the situation spiral out of control. Almost like he was playing a game, but with far higher stakes than anyone else in the room realized. This isn't just about you anymore, Sergeant, James said, his voice cold but oddly knowing. This is bigger than your career. This is about something much more dangerous. And I'm the only one who can help you navigate it. For a long moment, Mallerie didn't respond. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes flickering between the man in the suit and James, as if trying to piece together the puzzle that was rapidly becoming too complex for even her sharp mind to grasp. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaky but with a newfound edge. I want to know what the hell is really going on. I want to know everything. The man in the suit nodded, his lips curling into a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good choice. Because the moment you step off this path, there's no turning back. A shiver ran down Donovan's spine. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning that he had been dragged into something far worse than he had ever imagined. And now, he wasn't sure whether he would ever get out of it. Mallerie, still standing rigidly, gestured to Donovan, and without a word, he understood. She wasn't speaking to him directly, but the silent command was clear. Get out. This was a conversation that didn't involve him. His stomach churned as he reluctantly turned toward the door, but before he could step out, the man in the suit stopped him with one last line. Don't forget, officer, he said with a casual smile, you're a part of this now, whether you like it or not. Your choices today will determine whether you walk away free, or not at all. The door clicked behind Donovan, and he stood in the hallway, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of those words press on him from all sides. What had he just walked into? What had Mallerie just walked into? He looked down at his badge, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the cold metal. Everything he had known, everything he had trusted about the force, about his career, was beginning to unravel before his eyes. And whatever happened next, whatever decision Mallerie made, was going to send shockwaves through every part of their lives. He wasn't sure who he was more afraid of now, the man in the suit, or the unsettling quiet from behind the door. All he knew was that he had crossed a line, and he had no idea how to uncross it. The storm was coming, and it was too late to run. Donovan stood frozen in the hallway, his mind a swirling mess of confusion and dread. He knew he had to leave, but he couldn't move. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a 100-ton brick. What had started as a simple mix-up, a case of mistaken identity, had turned into something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Something he was now entangled in, whether he wanted to be or not. He heard muffled voices from the room behind the door, but he couldn't make out the words. The knot in his stomach tightened as he tried to piece together the events that had led him here. A federal prosecutor being in the wrong place at the wrong time wasn't an accident. And that man in the suit? He wasn't just a bystander, and neither was James. This wasn't just a department issue. This was something far more insidious. Forcing his legs to move, Donovan started down the hallway, moving towards the stairs when the door suddenly swung open behind him. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He turned to see Mallerie standing there, her face pale, but with an intensity in her eyes that Donovan hadn't seen before. "Get in here," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Now, Donovan's heart raced. The decision to stay had already been made for him. He stepped back into the room, every instinct telling him something was off, something was about to break wide open. Mallerie was now standing beside the stranger in the suit, her face unreadable, but the shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. She wasn't just the officer who'd been caught off guard by a mistake. She was in on it now. She had been pulled into something much bigger. The man in the suit, who still hadn't spoken directly to Donovan since entering, turned his gaze toward him now, his smile almost imperceptible. "You didn't really think you'd get out of this clean, did you, officer?" The words hit Donovan like a slap in the face. There was no comfort in his tone, no room for negotiation. It was a simple statement of fact. Donovan's stomach churned. He was standing in the middle of something monumental, something that could ruin him, ruin Mallerie, ruin everything they had worked for. He had no idea what to do next, no way to control the situation. Mallerie stepped forward, her jaw tight. "This isn't just about the arrest, is it? This is bigger. Tell me what's going on. Right now." The man in the suit finally spoke again, his voice as cold and calm as it had been from the start. "It's not about the arrest. It's about control. It's about power, and how much of it we're willing to let slip through our fingers. You two, you're pawns in a game much larger than either of you can imagine." Mallerie's eyes narrowed, but Donovan could see her trying to process what he was saying. "What game?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The man smiled again, the same cold, unsettling grin. "The kind of game that shapes entire cities, careers, lives. You're both in it now. All of you." He paused, as if to let the weight of his words sink in. "You're connected to something deeper. This department, it's nothing but a cog in a much bigger machine. And you're all part of it now, whether you like it or not." There was a long silence. Donovan could feel his pulse hammering in his ears as the room seemed to shrink around him. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but they all led to the same conclusion: he was in too deep. There was no way out. James, still sitting calmly at the table, looked up at the man in the suit and then back at Mallerie, his expression unreadable. "So, now that we're all on the same page, let's talk about how we're going to handle this." His voice was casual, but Donovan noticed the sharp edge beneath the surface. James wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. He was something else, something more dangerous. Mallerie seemed to steel herself, her posture becoming rigid. "Handle it?" she asked, her voice no longer trembling with uncertainty. "What do you mean by handle it?" The man in the suit turned his gaze back to her, his lips curling slightly. "We control the narrative, Sergeant. We control what people know. What they don't know. The truth is flexible. We're not going to let a little mistake unravel everything we've worked for." "But," he paused, glancing at Donovan, "you have to decide. Do you want to be part of this, or do you want to walk away? Because the moment you make the wrong choice, you'll be swept under the tide with everything else." Mallerie stood motionless, processing the offer, or the threat, laid out before her. Donovan could see the wheels turning in her mind. He didn't know what her decision would be. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, things were going to get a whole lot worse before they got better. Then, just as the tension in the room reached a breaking point, the door swung open once more, but this time, it wasn't just any officer or official who entered. It was another man, much younger, with a notebook in hand and an almost manic energy about him. He was unassuming, but something in his eyes told Donovan this wasn't just a regular officer or civilian. He wasn't supposed to be there. "Sergeant Mallerie," the man said breathlessly, glancing between her and the man in the suit. "There's a situation in the back. You need to come with me. Now." For a split second, the room went deathly still. Mallory's face remained unreadable, but Donovan could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The situation, whatever it was, had just escalated. And not in a way anyone had expected. "Stay here," Mallerie ordered, her voice suddenly cold as she turned and rushed toward the door. But before she could reach it, the man in the suit spoke again, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're not going anywhere until we finish this conversation." Mallerie froze, her back to him now. She didn't turn around, but Donovan could see the weight of the decision pressing on her. She was caught. No matter what she chose, no matter which way she moved, she was trapped. Then came the unexpected twist that no one had seen coming. The younger man stepped forward, his hand suddenly pulling something from inside his jacket, a badge. A federal badge. Mallerie and Donovan both froze as the man revealed the true nature of his identity. "I think you've been misled," he said, a sly smile spreading across his face. "I'm the one you should have been talking to this whole time." The room fell into a stunned silence, as the truth slammed into them all like a freight train. James was no longer just a prosecutor. The man in the suit was no longer the player behind the curtain. The situation they had thought was out of control? It was all orchestrated by someone higher up the food chain, someone they hadn't even been aware of. Donovan's heart stopped. The walls were closing in, and the very foundation of everything they thought they knew was crumbling beneath their feet. And as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Donovan realized the stakes had just reached an entirely new level. This wasn't just about power. It was about who controlled it, and who was going to pay the price for losing it. And, in the end, there was no way for any of them to walk away unscathed. The final twist? It was just beginning. The room was still, frozen in disbelief as the young man revealed his federal badge. Donovan could barely process the words hanging in the air, his mind spinning with confusion. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the man, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Mallerie turned slowly, her face drained of color as the realization sank in. The man in the suit, who had seemed so untouchable, wasn't the biggest threat after all. This new player, the one with the badge, was the one they should have been worried about from the start. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Evans," the man said, his tone calm but laced with an authority that left no room for questions. "And I'm here to clean up this mess before it gets any worse." James's expression twisted, his carefully composed demeanor cracking for the first time. "You're the one pulling the strings?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You've been orchestrating this entire thing?" Evans nodded, a thin smile on his lips. "I didn't orchestrate anything, James. I just ensured the right people got in the right places at the right time." He turned his gaze to Mallerie, who had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This department," Evans continued, "has been compromised for a long time. What you thought was corruption was just a small piece of the puzzle. I've been working with certain people to bring down the entire network, and now, thanks to your little mistake, it's time to wrap things up." The pieces were falling into place now, the full extent of the tangled web of deceit and corruption becoming clear. Donovan's mind reeled with the realization that he had been so close to the edge of something massive, something so much bigger than a simple wrong arrest. He hadn't been caught in the middle of a power struggle between a prosecutor and the police department. No, he had been a pawn in a much larger operation, one that spanned across government agencies, criminal organizations, and corrupt officials. And Mallerie had been right in the thick of it all. Mallerie seemed to shake herself out of her stupor, her eyes narrowing. "So, you've been pulling strings, making deals, and watching us all while we thought we were in control." "Why?" Evans's smile didn't falter. "I needed people who wouldn't ask questions. People who thought they knew the system inside and out. People who could be trusted to follow orders without questioning motives. And now?" His eyes flicked between her and Donovan. "Now, you're in deeper than you ever realized." Donovan felt a chill spread through his veins. He had thought he was following orders, doing his job the best way he knew how. He had never asked too many questions, had never dug too deep. But now he realized just how much he had been blind to. How much he had unknowingly become part of a much bigger conspiracy. "I don't get it," Mallerie said, her voice still sharp but tinged with frustration. "Why us? Why bring us into this?" Evans stepped closer, his eyes hardening. "Because, Sergeant, you're both exactly the type of people I needed. Smart, capable, loyal, unquestioning. And because, frankly, it was easier than you think to manipulate you both. Mallerie, you've been so focused on climbing the ranks that you never stopped to ask why things were always so easy. And Donovan? You've been following orders without ever questioning the system that gave them to you." Mallory's face flushed with anger, but Evans held up a hand, silencing her before she could respond. "But it's not too late for you both. You can still walk away. Help me clean up the mess, and you'll walk away free. Or you can keep playing your part in this charade, and you'll end up just like the rest of them, expendable." Donovan felt his stomach churn. Walk away? How could he? The damage was done, and the worst part was that he had no idea what kind of power Evans wielded. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how far-reaching Evans's influence was. If they did nothing, they could very well become targets. If they chose to act, they could be walking into something they couldn't control. Mallerie looked from Evans to Donovan, and for the first time since this all began, Donovan saw doubt in her eyes. She was torn. She wanted to stand up and fight, but the reality was sinking in. They weren't playing by the rules anymore. The system wasn't the ally they had always thought it was. It was a trap, and they had been caught in it. Evans seemed to sense her hesitation and took a step back. "I'll give you time to think about it," he said, his tone suddenly colder. "But make no mistake. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to end this." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mallerie and Donovan in the silence that followed. The door closed behind him with a finality that made Donovan's heart race. Mallerie stood there for a long moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Donovan knew that she was fighting with herself, weighing the choices in front of her. He was too, but he didn't have her clarity. He didn't have her years of experience in the department, in the system. All he knew was that things weren't going to go back to normal. The life he had known was gone, and the road ahead was uncertain. "I never signed up for this," Mallerie said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Donovan shook his head, unsure of what to say. There were no words that could make this right. No easy answers. He had always believed in the law, in the idea that good could triumph over evil, that justice would prevail. But now he wasn't so sure. Now he had seen the ugly underbelly of it all, the side that operated in the shadows, pulling strings and manipulating people like pawns in a game. "We'll do what's right," Donovan finally said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We'll find a way to fix this. But we can't do it alone." Mallerie looked at him, and for the first time in days, a flicker of something resembling hope seemed to cross her face. "You're right. We can't do it alone." They both knew what had to be done. They had to expose Evans and the entire operation before it consumed everything in its path. It wouldn't be easy. It would mean risking their careers, their lives, but the alternative was unthinkable. And as they walked out of the room, Mallory's hand on the door handle, Donovan couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. He had no idea how they were going to take down an operation this vast. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to let it keep growing, not without a fight. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As they moved through the corridors of the department, Donovan glanced at Mallerie, the uncertainty still hanging in the air between them. But there was something else, too, a resolve, a determination to make sure that justice, no matter how difficult or impossible it seemed, would have its day. And as they disappeared into the night, ready to take on a battle they knew could change everything, the final twist became clear. Sometimes, you have to break the rules to expose the truth. And that truth? It was more powerful than anything they had ever imagined.